Okay, so this is going to be the third and final part of your urinary system lecture. If you haven't already seen, I did post an announcement with a little analogy for the counter current multiplier system. So take a look at that if that section is still a little fuzzy for you. Okay, so where did we leave off? We left off talking about how we concentrate urine in the collecting duct, right? So after the loop of Henle, our urine is very dilute and we need to concentrate it. Most of the time we need to concentrate it. So how do we concentrate it? We do this using hormone control regulation of our collecting duct epithelium. So right here is our collecting duct epithelium. Right here would be our basal side. So over here is the basal side of our epithelium, and over here would be the apical surface of our epithelium that makes up the collecting duct. This area in here, this would be where we're holding the urine. Okay, once the filtrate hits the collecting duct, that is when we can officially call it urine. So here we have ADH, antidiuretic hormone, comes in, binds to a receptor on the basal side of this epithelium. That is going to send a signal, a cascade of signals that come in and cause us to exocytose vessels that have this little protein in them. This protein specifically is aquaporin. Aquaporin is a channel protein that allows water molecules to move across the membrane. So exocytosis is when we fuse this vessel with the plasma membrane. When we do that, this channel protein then gets moved to the surface of the cell. When it's at the surface of the cell, water molecules can move from the urine into the cell and then across the cell. There are always aquaporins on the basal side that allow the water to diffuse across and into the interstitial fluid and eventually into the blood. Okay? So ADH is our hormone that is regulating this process. We can store these aquaporins in the cytoplasm of the cell and have no aquaporins on the apical surface of the cells. And when that happens, water or the urine is going to pass through the collecting duct and water will not be reabsorbed and we will have dilute urine. On the other hand, if we shove a bunch of these aquaporins into the apical surface, we'll reabsorb that water and our urine will be concentrated. Okay. So this is regulated by ADH. ADH is secreted by your posterior pituitary gland. We have talked a little bit about diabetes mellitus in the past. Diabetes mellitus is the diabetes we think of when we hear the word diabetes. It is caused by dysregulation of the hormone insulin, which leads to increased blood glucose. When there's an increased level of blood glucose, that glucose gets filtered out in the glomerulus and ends up in the filtrate in the proximal convoluted tube. Now, in a healthy individual, we have enough receptors on the surface of our cell that we reabsorb most to all of our glucose that is in our filtrate. However, individuals with elevated levels of glucose, they'll saturate out those receptors. There will be so much glucose in that filtrate that all of those receptors are busy binding and reabsorbing the glucose and aren't able to reabsorb all of it. There's just not enough receptors to do that. They've saturated the system. So then the glucose will end up in the filtrate that will end up in the urine. And you pee out glucose, which is why you have a sweet urine when you have diabetes mellitus. Okay, so that's diabetes mellitus. Diabetes insipidus is a different form of diabetes. Diabetes insipidus is when you overproduce urine. Specifically, it has to do with your ability to absorb or reabsorb that water in the collecting duct. You're going to be urinating out a larger volume of urine that is more dilute because it has all of these water molecules that your body actually wants to keep in it but isn't. And it leads to dehydration. So this can actually occur because of pituitary damage. So recall your pituitary gland sits on the base or the inferior side of your brain, and it sits inside that sella torsia. If you have a blunt force impact that occurs on your head, you can damage that pituitary gland. Recall that pituitary gland is specifically connected to the hypothalamus by that infundibulum, that very tiny stalk, and your posterior pituitary specifically has axons running through that stalk that are going to come directly from the hypothalamus and release the ADH and oxytocin in the posterior pituitary gland. If you damage that stalk, you can sever and break those neuron axons. If you do that, you can inhibit or prevent the release of ADH or oxytocin. If you do this and you prevent the release of ADH, that blocks this whole pathway. So ADH is no longer in your system. You will no longer tell these vessels to fuse, and you will not have aquaporin on the surface or the apical side of these collecting ducts, and you will not reabsorb the water, which means that the water will be released and exit through your system, leading to dehydration. This is one of the common symptoms or problems that occurs from pituitary damage. Okay, what about alcohol? Alcohol inhibits ADH release. What effect will that have on the urine volume? What do you think? Yes, it would increase your urine volume. It inhibits ADH, so you would reduce the number of these aquaporins on the surface of the cell. They would be just sitting over here in these vessels, right? That's going to increase the amount of water that you're urinating out, which is going to dehydrate you. And this is one of the major causes of a hangover, is actually dehydration when you have alcohol consumption. Okay, so now we've talked about the proximal convoluted tube. Its main job is in reabsorption and secretion of specific molecules to make the filtrate more specific to what we want to get rid of, right? We're going to reabsorb the things that we want to keep, like glucose, while we're going to put in things like toxins or waste that we don't want. Then we talked about the loop of Henle and its job in regulating or creating this gradient in interstitial fluid. Okay, how we have water come out up here, salts come out down here, and then we end up with this hypoosmotic fluid that drips into the collecting duct, and then the collecting duct's job is to concentrate it to the level that we want. Okay, so there are two specific terms about the regulation of water that we want to talk about. There's facultative water resorption. Facultative water resorption is talking about the water that gets resorbed because of hormonal control. This happens here in the distal convoluted tube, as well as here in the collecting duct. Okay, so ADH has its role over here in the collecting duct. Aldosterone has a role in the reabsorption of water in the distal convoluted tube. As it pulls out more salts, it's going to pull out more water here in the distal convoluted tube. Both of these are areas that your body can regulate. Okay, obligatory water reabsorption is the water reabsorption that happens because of the setup of the system. Okay, that this is, you don't have control over this. Your body is not regulating this process. It is a process that is designed to lead to some water resorption, and that is the water resorption we're talking about right here. So this is the portion, this type of water resorption is what happens here in the proximal convoluted tube and in the nephron loop. So recall here that we are pulling water out of the filtrate here in the nephron loop, and this is part of that creating that gradient. So part of the system. This is obligatory, meaning it has to happen to create the system and for the system to function properly. So facultative water resorption is what you control by hormones, happens here in the distal convoluted tube and collecting duct. Obligatory water resorption happens in the nephron loop and in the proximal convoluted tube, and you don't control it, it just is what happens. Okay, so which type of water resorption occurs in the loop of Henle? Yes, obligatory. What type of water resorption happens in the proximal convoluted tube? Yes, obligatory. Okay. So for this final portion, we're going to focus on hormonal regulation. Specifically, we're going to look at the renin, angiotensin, and aldosterone pathway. Hopefully a few of these hormones ring a bell, because we've talked about a couple of them. Okay, so this is looking at a nephron. Here we have the afferent tube, so our arterial that is bringing blood in. We have the glomerulus with the capillaries right here, and the efferent arterial right here, exiting. We have the Bowman's capsule or the glomerulus capsule right here, and our filtrate would exit out here to the proximal convoluted tube. It would wind around, go down the nephron loop, and then the nephron loop actually winds itself back around and comes into very close contact with the afferent and efferent arterioles. These are going to allow, or this close contact allows us to have information that's regulating the flow rate as well as the blood pressure that is happening at the afferent arterial and in the nephron loop. So this would then move into the distal convoluted tube. This region right here that's coming into close contact, this is a special region called the macula densa. Over here, surrounding the afferent arterial, we have granular cells whose job it is to sense when we have a drop in blood pressure. When they sense that we have a drop in blood pressure, they are going to release renin. Okay. Oh, this complex right here is called the juxtaglomerular apparatus, or the JGA. Okay, juxtaglomerular apparatus. Okay, so what does renin do? Renin gets secreted by those cells around the afferent arterial when we see a drop in blood pressure. Renin then goes and it activates angiotensinogen. So recall, anytime we see an ogen name, that is a precursor hormone. So angiotensinogen is released from the liver as a precursor. It is circulating in your system all of the time, ready, just waiting to be activated. Renin, when your blood pressure drops, renin gets released and it cleaves angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 still needs to be further activated. It is activated by an enzyme that is secreted in the lungs called angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE. ACE comes in and further activates angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. Okay? And hopefully you recall angiotensin 2's job is to increase blood pressure. It does this immediately by vasoconstriction. This is an immediate response to raise blood pressure, to make sure that your blood pressure is staying in a okay range. Okay? Then it also is going to stimulate in the hypothalamus. Remember, your hypothalamus regulates your seven dwarfs, which include your thirst. It's going to stimulate your thirst in your hypothalamus, which is going to increase your water input, which will eventually lead to increased blood pressure. It also acts on the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex will release aldosterone. Aldosterone travels through the blood and will affect the kidneys, specifically in those distal convoluted tubes, their ability to resorb salt. So when we start resorbing more salt, we're also going to start resorbing more water in that region. This leads to sodium and water retention from your urine. So making sure that sodium and water stay in your system, which will lead to an increase in blood pressure. So overall, all three of these effects increase overall blood pressure. So there are three major hormones that raise your blood pressure. They affect the water-salt balance. We have renin, angiotensin 2. So renin is produced at the JGA, activating angiotensinogen. One will get activated into angiotensin 2 by ACE, and it has a role in regulating vasoconstriction. It also leads to the production of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. Aldosterone has a direct effect on the kidneys, leading to sodium resorption. And finally, the last hormone is ADH, and ADH's job is to affect the collecting ducts by pushing those aquaporins to the apical surface in the collecting duct, allowing water to be reabsorbed and concentrating urine. All three of these will increase blood pressure. Okay. So this hormone right here, atrial natriuretic peptide, is a peptide that's produced from the atrium of the heart when blood pressure starts to raise too high. When we start to see stretching of the atrium will produce this peptide to protect itself. This hormone has veto power over the other three hormones. Its job is to make sure that the blood pressure does not raise so high that your heart is injured. So essentially gives this atrial natriuretic peptide veto power over the other three, as that mechanism to keep everything in check. Okay, so that is it for urinary system.